Alright, we're going to talk about the structure and hydrolysis of ATP in this part of the lesson, so this is part 2. So ATP is going to be the main energy source for the cell. Any energy consuming process is going to probably use ATP. Sugars are a small part of the power source in cells, but ATP is going to be your biggest one. ATP is also renewable, so you can continue to make it so long as certain conditions are met. So we have a phosphate group, a part of the ATP, an adenine group, and a ribose sugar. So if you were to spell out the whole name for ATP, it's adenosine triphosphate. So there's the three phosphate groups. Okay? So ATP is going to undergo hydrolysis, which is the method in which it is able to release energy. So when you add in water, you're going to get a phosphate group, a phosphorylated intermediate, and you're going to get ADP in addition to energy. And this energy source from ATP is going to be useful for mechanical work, such as movement, the contracting and constricting of muscles. It's also going to be used for transport, so transporting molecules across the cell membrane. And it'll be useful for chemical reactions as well. And we'll see an example of a chemical reaction on the next slide. So in this diagram, what we're basically seeing is the same reaction, glutamic acid plus ammonia to make glutamine. But we're going to see this in 3 different steps. So just looking at the reaction as itself, we have the glutamic acid and the ammonia, and it forms this glutamine. Okay, we're using up about 3.4 kilocalories per mole of free energy. Now when you look at it with ATP involved, basically what happens is you've got that glutamic acid. You have to have an ATP molecule. We're going to have what's called a phosphorylated intermediate, where that phosphate's going to be added to the glutamic acid. We'll have ATP. This is where the ammonia will come in, and that gives us glutamine, which also gives us an ADP and an extra phosphate. Okay, and this reaction right here is just going to show us all those steps again, but showing us how much energy is being put in and how much is being released. So before I get into this slide, we're going to have what's called a phosphorylated intermediate. And basically what a phosphorylated intermediate is when you transfer a phosphate to some other molecule. And that molecule then is going to temporarily have that phosphate group until it is no longer needed, then it will be released. Really, ATP drives all endergonic reactions, and it does this by this process of phosphorylation. So in this example, we've got ATP added, you've got that phosphate attached to the transport protein. Once the protein opens to move the solute through the cell membrane, that phosphate will be released, and you're left with ADP plus 1 phosphate. Same thing with transport work. You've got a vesicle and motor protein. That motor protein is going to have the ATP added to it. It's going to move, and when it moves, that ADP and phosphate group are going to be released. And so I mentioned earlier that ATP is basically a renewable energy source in the cell. And so what's going to happen is when you have ATP, it goes from, with hydrolysis, water added, it goes from ATP to ADP, and so that's going to be the endergonic energy consuming process. We've got energy released to do cellular work. When we have ADP going back to ATP, we are going to have a phosphate group added to ADP, so that phosphorylated intermediate molecule is going to be added back, and that energy to phosphorylate ADP comes from catabolic reactions from inside the cell. So those are going to be the exergonic energy releasing processes. So processes that put in energy is actually going to help create that energy, and then we're going to have that cycle continue on and on. It's just going to keep going in a big old loop.